This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a Professor Emeritus in History at Bar-Ilan University and author of numerous books, many of which about the British Mandate of Palestine, including a new one entitled Britain's Moment in Palestine, Retrospect and Perspectives, 1917 to 1948, that was recently published in English by Routledge. Professor Michael J Cohen, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good morning. Thank you.
So let me start by asking you this. Some historians have argued that as far as British interests are concerned, the Balfour Declaration was London's most disastrous foreign policy decision of the 20th century. How fair do you think this assessment is?
Well, that is using the very easy-to-come-by wisdom of hindsight. Everybody is very clever after the event. But at the time, it was a very smart move. It was a necessary move. They issued the declaration because, first and foremost, Britain and France, the Allies, were on their back heels in the war. And they desperately needed the Americans to come into the war. Likewise, they desperately needed the Russians, who were on the verge of revolution by February 1917. They desperately needed the Russians to stay in the war. And lo and behold, in fact, Britain essentially believed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. They believed that the all-powerful, influential Jews would influence the White House to make America enter the war. And they believed that the Jews who led the Bolsheviks would keep the communists in the war likewise. Instead of leaving Britain and France alone to face Germany on her own without Germany being bothered with the Eastern Front of the Russians.
So the decision fully was inspired by anti-Semitism, essentially.
Indirectly, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
so
it's ironic.
It really doesn't account for a good statesmanship, does it?
Well, it does, because when you're fighting a war and on the verge of losing, there's only one important thing in life, and that is to survive and to win the war, to turn the war. Now, that's not the only reason, but I would say that critically, that is the main reason. Not only that, but the Germans also believed in the influence, the international influence of the Jews, as per protocols. And the British feared, when they came to the final decision, end of October 1917, 3 days before the Balfour Declaration, they feared, and Weizmann exaggerated this fear. Mm-hmm. He told them, if you don't give us a declaration, the Germans might, they're about to. And that was brought up in the cabinet meeting. And at the crucial cabinet meeting, Lord Curzon, who was anti-Zionist and didn't believe that Palestine could absorb them, in his opening speech...
Absorb the Jews.
Right. Mm-hmm. It was a backward country, of course, and no room to have a mass immigration of Jews. Curzon said, well, from the propaganda point of view, I think it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. How soon did they realize that they made a mistake?
I think they realized almost immediately with the first riots, Arab riots in Palestine.
In 1920?
In 1920. In Pesach, 1920. Now, perhaps I should put a reservation on that. That was the time of the military administration. So there's a tendency to blame the military. They had been harsh. They had been recommending beforehand the abrogation of the declaration and even setting Faisal up over Palestine. And the British tended to blame him. And there was also a Foreign Office representative in Palestine at the time, Meinetzhagen, who sent a very damning report of the negligence of the military administration. They hadn't had enough troops on the spot to defend the Jews of Jerusalem, who were the main victims in that. And those May riots, in fact, brought about an end to the military administration even before the League of Nations had granted the mandate.
Right.
And so you have in July, Samuel, a Jewish high commissioner, is appointed as the first high commissioner. Then you have another wave of riots in May 1921, on the 1st of May, which began as a sort of mistake, clashes on the border of Tel Aviv-Jaffa, which spread. And then the British were forced to come to their senses. And Samuel immediately suspended immigration for a month, and they brought out the new white paper. And there was a whole round of talks which brought to the 1922 white paper.
So, would you say that this was really the beginning of Britain's estrangement from Zionism?
Yeah, well, I would say it's very interesting. The Colonial Office officials in London and the officials in Jerusalem, they all realized it had been a mistake. Samuel was an exception. He had a long history of being a Zionist until he became High Commissioner. And he said, he was the most moderate. He said, well, we've got to go slow. We've got to take the Arabs into account. But high policy stipulated that Britain had made a pledge.
High policy, you mean the government in London?
The government in London, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. And the amazing thing is that in the end of 22, the wartime coalition of Lloyd George fell and a Conservative government was elected soon afterwards. Now, the Conservatives, until November 22, from the end of the war, they had been very, very extremely critical of the Zionist policy, of British support for Jewish national home. So the Palestinians, they said, salvation is here. Now those critics, which included the owners of the Times and the Daily Telegraph, key papers and influential papers in England, Palestinians believe, now they're going to set it right. And in May 23, the Conservative government sets up a committee to decide what are we going to do with Palestine. Are we going to stand by the declaration? And no one other than Curzon, the same Lord Curzon,
same anti-Zionist.
Who'd been an anti-Zionist, who didn't know how we're going to bring Jews in and what they're going to live on, etc. He headed the committee, and for three big reasons, they came to the decision that Britain had to hang on to the mandate. Firstly, because the mandate had been endorsed by the League of Nations. And the mandate included, in Clause 4, support for the Jewish national home.
Therefore, it's within the realm of international law and not a policy decision, a domestic policy decision.
Exactly. And Britain, as a small country, dependent on a huge fleet, it was really top-heavy with a fleet. A small island, which, as Churchill said, without the empire, we become Little England. They needed international trust. And they said in this cabinet committee, if we renege on this trust to the Zionists, then where are we going to find allies in the future? No one will believe in us. But another point, I researched this in the last 7 or 8 years, was the extent to which the British in Palestine became dependent on Jewish capital to fund not only the Jewish national home, but the British administration. And not only that, but building the port at Haifa, building the road and oil pipeline from Baghdad to Haifa and Tripoli.
Jewish capital from where?
Mainly from the US. Zionist-generated capital, which of course produced a paradox, because the Jews were giving money for Zionist settlement, not for keeping the British mandate in Palestine. So you had a relatively quiet 7 or 8 years, until 1929, when the British were dependent on Jewish capital. And the third reason that this cabinet committee decided we've got to stay in Palestine, because if we leave, and without the Balfour Declaration, we've got no raison d'etre, no justification for staying in Palestine. If we leave, that will allow the French to move in and get near to the Suez Canal. and the Suez Canal is the main imperial artery to the crown, the jewel in the crown, India.
Yes.
And
so Palestine was a buffer in some sort of way.
Exactly. Or the French would threaten the imperial artery. Now, the
common wisdom that Palestine was just a peripheral territory in the British Empire is not entirely accurate. They saw immense strategic importance in keeping Palestine.
Well, it was an indirect, okay? It was a question of don't allow Palestine to go by default. We can't afford the French to get too close to the canal. You might say, the British and the French were at loggerheads. The French believed, quite rightly, in fact, quite justifiably, that the British had used the Zionists to kick them out of Palestine because the 1916 Sykes-Picot arrangement had provided for Anglo-French and Russian rule of Palestine. Nobody knew how that could possibly work out, but Palestine had been an international zone, according to the 16. Now, to really answer your question, your first question, the breaking point was 1929, 1930, the Wailing Wall riots.
And the destruction of the Jewish community in Hebron.
That wasn't a breaking point for the British. It was a disaster which the British High Commissioner, Chancellor, condemned, but very unfortunate. But the same Chancellor was very anti-Zionist. He was also anti-Semitic. We have his private letters to his son and to other friends in the Colonial Office in London. They knew that their bread was buttered on the Arab side. And the 1930 White Paper, the second of the three major White Papers, most historians have not even noted that it was never, in fact, passed into law.
It was meant to restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine.
It would have literally ended the Jewish national home. Now, the 22 White Paper had stipulated that Jewish immigration would be allowed into Palestine according to the economic absorptive capacity of the Yishuv, of the Jews. How many jobs could the Jewish agency find the new immigrants? They would not be allowed to fall as a burden on the British or on the British taxpayer. Okay? Now, the 1930 White Paper, issued by a minority Labour government, that provided that no Jewish immigrant should be allowed in if there's one Arab unemployed. The whole population, not just the Jewish population. So long as there was Arab unemployment, no Jewish immigration. It also stipulated that the current amount of lands held by the Arabs was only enough to provide a living for their offspring. There was no spare land for Jewish settlement. This would have ended. And in fact, the 30 White Paper is a predecessor of the 39 White Paper, which severely restricted immigration.
And then they started toying with the idea of partition as well.
Only in 1937, after the Arab riots. The interesting point to note here is that the 30 White Paper was brought to a debate in Parliament. It was never voted on, because the Labour knew they would never pass it. And that mainly was because in 1930, England, like most of the world, was in a Great Depression following the Wall Street crash of 1929. So the British could not afford to lose the capital which was coming in from America. And likewise,
was it that significant?
It was, well, for them, but even more than that. They still believed in the protocols. They still believed in Jewish influence in America. And America then was turning nasty. In her own depression, she was demanding the return of loans from Britain, owed from World War I. So the British believed that American Jews could be the turning point. They could turn America against them.
How did the Zionist leadership react to this gradual shift away from Zionism by the British? And, they were playing really a dual game all along.
Right. Well, let me just say the 30 white paper was repaired. It was altered by a private letter from the Prime Minister to Weizmann. Most extraordinary event. I don't think, as far as I know, there's no other event to compare with it in British constitutional history, that a white paper is revoked, in effect, by a private letter to the head of the Zionist movement, which contradicted completely. You know, there's no clash between Arab and Zionist interests, and we will allow immigration, we'll allow...
Because they
settling.
thought Weizmann was orchestrating a world conspiracy?
Well, he was about to go to America, and he was held as the one who could turn the tables. Now, I say that this achievement of Weizmann in 1931, February 31, this letter, it was greater than the Balfour Declaration itself. It saved Zionism from defeat, because had it been defeated in 1931, you would have had all of the Fourth Aliyah, the German Aliyah, which doubled the numbers of the Yishuv from 200 to 400,000.
Those German Jews who fled
who
Nazism.
were fleeing from, nobody at that moment in 1931, nobody knew Hitler was going to be elected to power.
I'd like to ask you now to fast forward to the post-war, after the Second World War, because we are running out of time, unfortunately. Tell us a bit about the internal debate within Whitehall and even in London at large that eventually led to the end of the mandate, to the decision that Britain made to pack its bags and leave. I think there were two. First of all, the British tried in a series of international committees with the Americans. The Americans, under the influence of the Zionist lobby, were making many pro-Zionist statements. And in November 1945, the British, Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, he made the decision, he passed it through the cabinet. Well, instead of them sitting on the sidelines, let's involve them. So they set up an Anglo-American committee. And interestingly, this committee was delayed from October to mid-November until after the congressional elections of beginning of November. The Americans said, okay, we'll come on the committee, but delay it till then so it won't become a plaything amongst the candidates for the elections. And this committee, it should be noticed, decided no Jewish state, no partition. And they suggested continuation of the British mandate in another form, a trusteeship. But they did suggest the immediate aliyah of 100,000, which the Zionists sprang on. But in fact was a very anti-Zionist report because it ruled out a Jewish state. But anyway, these attempts at cooperation with the Americans, they didn't succeed. It's again trying to square the circle, right?
It is, yes. I mean, again, we can be easily clever enough and look back. That's my opinion. There was no possibility, given, of course, that neither side, neither the Jews nor the Arabs, were willing to compromise. There was no way that the Arabs, any Arab party, was going to agree to a Jewish state. And especially we should remember that in 1945, the Yishuv must have been around 500,000, and the Arabs doubled that number. So why should they let a minority have a state, whatever size? And two major events pricked the British to move out. The first was the killing of two British sergeants, August 1946.
By the Irgun.
By the Irgun. And next, in January 1947, they moved, the Irgun walked into a courtroom in Tel Aviv, and they abducted the judge in mid-court setting. They also abducted a retired major of the British Army in Jerusalem. The British drew the conclusion they can't protect their own people. At the end of the month, they evacuated over 2,000 people, non-essential personnel, all of the men and women. They set up Bevingrads. They sequestrated areas and set up high blocked walls. The soldiers were given orders, don't go out in less than threes. Don't go out alone. However, above all this was the American veto. The British after World War II were entirely dependent on the Americans for aid and for military defense against the Russians, the Soviets, in what was feared might any day break out as World War III. And I've also written on that. And so they could not go against the American will. They could not rule out a Jewish state and let the Jews go to the dogs in Palestine.
Right. And also the point that you made earlier about Palestine being very lucrative in terms of the development of infrastructure, etc. Was this no longer the case after the Second World War?
I don't think I mentioned the word lucrative. I said that the Jewish money was paying for the administration, a large part of the administration of Palestine. But from the mid-30s, you have a turn. Even though Weizmann secured that letter in February 31, the British could see the writing on the wall. With the rise of Hitler and with the Italian conquest of Abyssinia in 1936, Ethiopia, this was a real turning point. Not least because during that conquest, the British were engaged in the East Mediterranean. They feared that there might be a war with the Italians if they turned on Egypt. The Germans took the opportunity to demilitarize Rhineland. The Germans took the first step to rolling back the Versailles Treaty. And the British saw that they had three enemies on their hands: Germany first, Italy second, and Japan in the Far East, who had also walked out of the League of Nations in 1934. And they were top priority. Again, survival trumped any economic benefit. And of course, the Arab world had military bases and oil. That was also a benefit. The Palestinians in themselves were never a number one priority, their interests. But the material assets of the Arab states, those the British could not afford to lose.
All right. In the words of Basil Fawlty, I could spend the rest of my life having this conversation, but sadly, we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Professor Michael J. Cohen, author of the recently published Britain's Moment in Palestine, Retrospect and Perspectives, 1917 to 1948. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.